Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 5 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, in a half PPR scoring format, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers, in order to grant ourselves more insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After we talk about the matchups portion of today's video, we'll then transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share with you guys statistics to justify the reasons as to why I have my wide receiver rankings set as such and how I think the week is going to pan out. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel with your viewership, clicking the like button down below every single day. Again, for those of you who have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It takes 2 seconds and it gives you an advantage for the rest of the 2022 fantasy football season. We're making daily fantasy football content in order to help you win this upcoming weekend's matchup and, of course, your 2022 fantasy football championship. So be sure, subscribe to the channel. Help us get to our goal of 70,000 subscribers. We're very closely there, so we greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the wide receiver conversation for Week 5, beginning with matchups. Immediately to the right of me, you can see statistics on screen that are shared in regards to how many points defenses have given up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR, splitting it in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or in a full PPR format. As you can see, the Baltimore Ravens, along with the Los Angeles Rams, Washington Commanders, have been the worst teams in terms of giving up fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. I mean, on a per week average, 40.7 per week is an incredibly high number. And even off of this last weekend's performance of Buffalo Bills wide receivers not doing much against that Baltimore Ravens secondary, that's still a relatively high number because of the high watermark that we saw Devontae Parker and, of course, Jaylen Waddle and Tyreek Hill post on this defense just weeks ago. Nonetheless, an advantageous matchup, and the thumbnail of today's video, of course, Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, they will be able to take care of this because they have an incredible advantage. Nonetheless, we're just giving you some insight in regards to these statistics. Of course, a lot of these teams at the top have given up a bunch of yards, given up a lot of receptions and touchdowns, while on the other end of the spectrum, like the Chicago Bears, Denver Broncos, New York Giants, they really haven't given up much through the air. But in some of these circumstances, it really has to do with the fact that when they're playing up against other teams, it's very neutral in regards to the score of the games isn't one-sided. And if it is, it's on the opposite side where the teams are running the ball against the Giants, the Broncos, and the Bears, and they're not having to pass very often, which has kind of scaled down these numbers. But either way, we'll go ahead, identify some cornerback matchups going into the week. We'll refer back to these statistics as we progress throughout the entirety of today's video, and we'll designate the matchup difficulty based on the stars that are on screen. As you can see, Cooper Kupp has himself a 3-star matchup against the Dallas Cowboys this upcoming week. Yes, it may be an average matchup, but ultimately his talent is going to take him far beyond the matchup in itself. The opportunities that he's granted takes him to the next level. So let's get into our top 36 wide receiver conversation. Speaking of Cooper Kupp, the couple of stats that I wanted to mention, of course, we're starting Cooper Kupp regardless of what we're doing, coming off of an incredible 19.2 fantasy point performance on Monday night, playing 100% of the offensive snaps. The couple stats that I wanted to mention, first and foremost, in terms of target share, he controls 36% of the LA Rams target share. Not only that, he currently controls 39.62% of Matthew Stafford's completed passes. He also has control of 39.61% of passing yardage that has been thrown to receiving options in this team. And he has 75% of Matthew Stafford's touchdowns completed. Matthew Stafford has only thrown 4 touchdowns this season. Of course, Cooper Kupp has 3 of them. Just giving you some context as to just how important, how vital he is to this team. Coming off of a week of 14 catches and 19 targets, those are some ridiculously high numbers, and they're not stopping anytime soon. Moving on to Justin Jefferson, he takes on the Chicago Bears, and though the Chicago Bears really haven't given up much points to opposing wide receivers, don't let that fool you. When you go ahead and you look at Kyler Gordon, the second-round rookie cornerback that was drafted by the Chicago Bears, brought in to be one of these primary cornerbacks, he has been one of the worst corners in the National Football League. He has had a rough first month of the season. In fact, he's allowed the 5th most receptions amongst all cornerbacks in the league, while he's also given up the most receiving yards as a cornerback amongst all in the league throughout the first month of the season. That in itself, of course, is going to give Justin Jefferson an advantage as he'll be on the field and obviously dominating. He did take a 2-week hiatus from weeks 2 to 3. But for those of you who just stuck with him, potentially traded for him, you saw a great performance this last week of 10 catches, 147, had himself a rushing touchdown, which was the identical play that a week prior, the Los Angeles Rams utilized with Cooper Kupp. They want to make Justin Jefferson the Cooper Kupp of this team. They're continuing the transition in that direction. In the last 2 years that he's played against the Chicago Bears, he's averaged 16.05 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting higher numbers than that. but it's a pretty solid base of production. Moving on to Stefon Diggs taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. This could very easily be a one-sided affair because of Kenny Pickett. If Kenny Pickett comes out and isn't able to find much success against the Buffalo Bills defense, this could be extremely one-sided, similar to the game in which we had in week 2, where the Buffalo Bills completely dominated that Tennessee Titans team. Now, even though Stefon Diggs is coming off of a relatively underwhelming performance last week of 8.2 fantasy points, we have to take into account that Josh Allen just didn't play well. The weather conditions obviously played a factor, and so did the defense. He only had 213 passing yards and had a 53% passing completion percentage, which is extremely low, especially for Josh Allen. That all being mentioned, when we talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers and opposing wide receivers finding success against them, Jamar Chase, 10 catches, 129 and a touchdown. Nelson Aguilar, 6 catches, 110 and a touchdown. Amari Cooper, 7 catches, 101 and a touchdown. And of course, last week we had Corey Davis, 5 catches, 74 and a touchdown. Number one wide receivers find success against this team. I'm expecting Stefon Diggs to do so as well. Regardless of what is going on with Gabriel Davis, Isaiah McKenzie, I'm expecting, of course, the number one stud wide receiver of this team to find a lot of success. Moving on to Jamar Chase, the thumbnail of today's video. Like we mentioned a little bit earlier, he has the easiest matchup in the week, going up against the Baltimore Ravens secondary that has struggled mightily this season. But one of the primary reasons why Jamar Chase, in my opinion, has number one overall wide receiver of the week upside this week is because his past performances against the Baltimore Ravens. Last year, in the 2 contests the Cincinnati Bengals took on their division rivals, of course, Jamar Chase had himself 30.1 fantasy points and 16.0 fantasy points. In the 2 games in which Cincinnati Bengals played against the Baltimore Ravens last year, Joe Burrow had 941 passing yards and 7 passing touchdowns. As a team, they had a 41 point per game average against that defense. Both games, individually, 41 points on top of them. That in itself gives me a lot of confidence. We've seen other wide receivers throughout this season find a lot of success against this defense. It is a beautiful 5-star matchup in which we're obviously starting Jamar Chase and hoping for the big game. Moving on to Davante Adams, our number 5. Now, I'm extremely excited about the potential of Davante Adams, mainly because of a couple of the factors that we anticipate to see going into the week. First and foremost, the Kansas City Chiefs have beaten the Las Vegas Raiders in 7 out of the last 8 meetings that they have had. In fact, last season, they blew them out completely. It just wasn't even close contest in any sort of capacity. In fact, the Raiders had to completely stop running the ball in the 4th quarter, similar to what exactly we saw from Tampa Bay last weekend. Now, if in fact this is going to once again be the case, I'm expecting Davante Adams to get himself a lot of opportunity. And when he does, playing up against Snead, Fenton, and Watson, those are 3 cornerbacks that are certainly going to be vulnerable when you're taking on one of the best wide receivers in the league. Of course, recently we've seen Mike Evans go for 8 catches, 103, and 2 touchdowns last week. Of course, a couple weeks prior to that on Thursday Night Football, Mike Williams went for 8 catches, 113, and a touchdown. Big-bodied wide receiver ones have found success against this defense. Why not Davante Adams? Moving on to Mike Evans. Speaking of coming off of an incredible week, like I just mentioned, of 8 catches, 103 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns in a matchup in which they had to come back the entire game. It's a beautiful way to reintroduce Mike Evans off of the suspension. This is a player that we talked about a couple weeks back in terms of a must-trade for wide receiver. You wanted to go out and grab him, and I understand he has name value, and it is going to be difficult to go after him, but ultimately, for those of you who had an opportunity to do so and grabbed him and got him on roster, he's going to continue to pay dividends for the rest of the season. Now, this upcoming week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons, a division rival and quite frankly, an easy matchup. Again, last season, in the 2 matchups that he took on the Atlanta Falcons, 22 points and 13.4 fantasy points. It is an incredible matchup in the idea that as long as we are getting the services of Chris Godwin, Julio Jones back, we know that Cole Beasley retired, but as long as this receiving core is beginning to kind of at least develop back to what they were in week 1, we could very easily see Mike Evans continue the success, a little bit of the pressure pulled off of his back to make plays every single down. And in the 2 full games we've seen him play this season, he's already scored 3 touchdowns. There's a lot of promise here for Mike Evans in an advantageous matchup. Moving on to Tyreek Hill. Now, speaking of an advantageous matchup, Tyreek Hill pretty much makes every matchup favorable for him based on the speed that he presents. He completely changes the math of a defense. They always have to go ahead and double cover him. But when he is put in situations where he becomes a yak monster, yards after the catch, when he gets into situations where he's catching the ball close to the line of scrimmage and they're allowing him with his speed and his ability to make defenders miss, gain yardage and gain fantasy value, that is something that defines him as a receiving option. Of course, thus far this season, he's number 4 amongst all receiving options in the National Football League behind Austin Eckler, Dallas Goedert, and Deebo Samuel in terms of yards after the catch. Now, with Teddy Bridgewater most likely being the starting quarterback for the foreseeable future of the Miami Dolphins season, we're expecting to see a lot of targets go in the direction of Tyreek Hill, because once Teddy Bridgewater stepped into that game Thursday night against Cincinnati Bengals, he targeted Tyreek Hill 8 times, 6 catches, 109 receiving yards. One of those catches, 50 plus yards down the field. A lot of opportunity is going to be taken advantage here. And we have to remember, Tyreek Hill is a deep receiving threat. Thus far this season, he's number 3 in terms of deep passing targets sent in his direction. 10 targets that have led to 6 catches and 2 receiving touchdowns. I expect to see a lot of production out of Tyreek Hill this week, even though there's a quarterback change against the New York Jets defense. Moving on, we have T. Higgins as our number 8. Again, just in the same vein in which we just mentioned Ja'Marr Chase having himself a big week, why not T. Higgins? T. Higgins at times this season has already looked like the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. Of course, coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets, 7 catches, 124, and a touchdown, while the other side of the field, Ja'Marr Chase is getting double covered, T. Higgins is running freely, and he is scoring, and he's finding a lot of success. Already in the 2 full games that he has played this year, he's had 16.1 and 21.9. If we're going to continue that trend, especially against the Baltimore Ravens, let's not forget last season, in the 2 games he took on the Ravens, 9.7 fantasy points and 37.4. He was targeted 28 times in those 2 contests combined. And like I mentioned in regards to Ja'Marr Chase earlier on in today's episode, Joe Burrow against that defense had 900 plus passing yards and 7 passing touchdowns last season. There's a lot of success to be had here in a very advantageous matchup. We're firing up T. Higgins, coming off of a little bit of an extra rest considering they played on Thursday, hopefully recovered from any injuries that he was dealing with. Moving on to A.J. Brown, our number 9, taking on the Arizona Cardinals defense. Now, A.J. Brown, for his own respective team, has accounted for 50.5% of the air yardage. Can you imagine that? That number alone is unbelievable. On top of the fact that in terms of target share, he's commanding a 30.89% rate. That in itself is ridiculous. As long as he is continuing to get a high target count, he's continuing to see a lot of passing opportunities down the field that allows him to make plays over defenders and score touchdowns, he's going to be in a perfect position to succeed. Now, even though this last week there was the rain conditions, again, he's a top-tier wide receiver. Regardless of what the conditions are, he is going to succeed, coming off of a week of 12 fantasy points, 5 catches for 95 receiving yards. Luckily, they play against the Arizona Cardinals, who thus far this season have not scored a single point in the first quarter. When this team mounts a lead, and they do so using, of course, Jalen Hurts, of course, their receiving core of Dallas Goedert, Devontae Smith, but mainly A.J. Brown, he should have himself a pretty impactful week. Moving on to Deebo Samuel, taking on the Carolina Panthers. I mentioned it last week. We wanted to have traded for Deebo Samuel prior to the breakout, and we knew the breakout was coming mainly because when he takes on the LA Rams, it's a completely different Deebo Samuel. He steps up, and he absolutely balls out, and that's exactly what he did. He had himself 20.7 fantasy points, in which he had no utilization in terms of rushing statistics. 7 targets, 6 catches, 115 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Many of us witnessed the fact that, of course, the Rams are allergic to covering screen passes, especially those of the variety going in the direction of Deebo Samuel. But nonetheless, I'm expecting to see Deebo Samuel getting a lot more utilization as the wide receiver 1 of this team. And if that's going to be the case, of course, they're going to sprinkle in a couple rushing attempts. And maybe one of those breaks out for a touchdown because he is such a talented threat. But right now, he's a yak monster, number 3 amongst all options in the National Football League with 200 yards after the catch. Obviously, a lot of those coming from that Rams game. And he has had 4 consecutive weeks of 10-plus fantasy points. I'm expecting another great performance against the Carolina Panthers. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb, one of the final of our wide receiver 1 conversation. CeeDee Lamb, even with Cooper Rush, has been unbelievable. Consecutive weeks of 18.7 fantasy points. Consecutive weeks of a receiving touchdown. That in itself continues to validate the reason why he is one of the top wide receivers in the league and why we drafted him as to being a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football. His current targets per route run is a 30.43%. That means on 30% of the routes that he is running, he is getting a target in his direction. The Dallas Cowboys thus far this season already have proven they're going to be a pass-first team going forward. And because of the tough LA Rams run-stopping defense this upcoming week, we expect to see Cooper Rush throwing the ball a bunch. And of course, looking in the direction of CeeDee Lamb to find a lot of success for our fantasy teams. Let's go ahead and move on to Amon-Ra St. Brown, the final of our wide receiver 1 conversation. As I'm recording this video, I have no indication as to whether or not he is going to play. I don't even know if he practiced today. So we're going to go ahead and keep a close eye on him. Obviously, you know that if he's active, you're playing him regardless of matchup, because in the first 3 weeks of the season, he has already averaged 20.53 fantasy points per game. Amon-Ra St. Brown is just a completely different cat. He's just unbelievable in anything that he attempts to do, averaging 11 targets, 7.7 catches, 84 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown per game. That all being said, hopefully he's active, hopefully he's healthy, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Detroit Lions shut him down similar to the way that they're doing with DeAndre Swift, where they'll shut them down for another consecutive week here, and then they'll hit their week 6 bye and return in week 7 healthy and ready to go. Moving on, let's go ahead and pop up our top 12 on the screen, giving you guys some indication as to where we're going in terms of our rankings. Of course, these are our must-start players. These are our stud wide receivers that you have no question in regards to starting, but to give you a little bit more information in regards to how well they're playing and how well their matchups potentially look this upcoming week. We've talked about them. Be sure to go ahead, stop by Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirkoff. We'll be live streaming here on the channel with updated rankings regarding our top 36 wide receivers, running backs, top 16 tight ends, and quarterbacks up to date on screen for the full 2 hours of that Sunday morning stream. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the wide receiver 2 conversation, beginning with Mike Williams. Mike Williams takes on the Cleveland Browns defense. Last season, he had the privilege of taking on this defense, and this was a very high-scoring matchup. In fact, Mike Williams himself had himself 32.5 fantasy points in that contest. Now, he's coming off of a week in which he had 11 targets, 7 catches, 120 receiving yards, 15.5 fantasy points. An incredible week, in my opinion, and hopefully going forward, we're going to continue to see that volume level of targets. That has always been the biggest difference maker between a great and a horribly bad week for Mike Williams. It's purely been targets. And mainly, of course, you get targets when you find yourself open. It's just a matter of hoping that Mike Williams will continue to do so this upcoming week against Cleveland. Again, over the course of the last 2 seasons, 2021 and 2022 thus far, in the games in which Mike Williams has been given 7 or more targets, he's averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game. We're hoping for this kind of success. Of course, we've seen this success in the past against this Cleveland Browns defense. They're going to continue to utilize that same strategy they did last year because the defense is the same. A lot of the personnel is the same. It's just a matter of whether or not Justin Herbert's ready to step up and ball out. Moving on to Marquise Hollywood Brown, our number 14. Finally, we got Marquise Hollywood Brown in an actual Cardinals jersey. It just took a couple weeks to find a really high quality image in that regard. But he's finally here and he's arrived on the scene. In the last 2 weeks, he has had 28 targets. 17 in 1 week, and just this past week, 11 targets leading to 6 catches, 88 yards, and a touchdown, 17.8 fantasy points. And even though this team has worked off negative game scripts the entire year and have continued to have to come back in games in order to compete, ultimately, it's kind of benefited Marquise Hollywood Brown thus far. The fact that they always have to throw for majority of the second half will continue to lead to a lot of targets, a lot of red zone and end zone targets, and of course, the secondaries of this team trying to bottle up all the receiving threats of the Cliff Kingsbury offense. I mean, again, when Cliff Kingsbury is coming out in 4 wide sets, it is definitely going to make it a little bit difficult on a defense to go ahead and stop them. This upcoming week, they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. If any secondary is equipped with enough cornerbacks and safeties in order to kind of bottle up an Arizona Cardinals passing attack, it would be the Philadelphia Eagles. You'll most likely see a lot of Darius Slay, but they do like to run a lot of zone. If you can go ahead, come up with some zone beaters here, I'm expecting to see a lot of success and a lot of opportunity specifically in the direction of Marquise Hollywood Brown. Moving on to Chris Godwin on number 15. I think it's time. Chris Godwin, after this last week's performance, has established himself back ready to go, and Tom Brady is going to send the ball in his direction. Now that we've seen, of course, Russell Gage not get much opportunity, Cole Beasley retire, we're looking down the rest of the season being a pretty successful year for Chris Godwin. Again, he takes on the Atlanta Falcons. Last season, in the 2 games he took on the Atlanta Falcons, 14.2 fantasy points and 22.7. Of course, this last week, even though he was coming off the hamstring injury, 10 targets, 7 catches, 59 yards. Of course, it was a heavily negative game script in the favor of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers having to throw the entire time. But ultimately, it's just a matter of whether or not he's going to continue to stay healthy and those opportunities are going to go in his direction. Luckily for him, the Atlanta Falcons have struggled against slot wide receivers thus far this season already. Jarvis Landry, week 1, 7 catches, 114. Cooper Kupp in week 2, 11 catches, 108 and 2 touchdowns. And Tyler Lockett, a couple weeks back, 9 catches, 76 receiving yards. A lot of potential here for this wide receiver in the week 5 matchup. Moving on to Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk's been one of the most consistent wide receivers in fantasy football. And though he had an underwhelming performance of 7.3 fantasy points, we have to take into account he still had another week of 9 targets. I mean, thus far this season already, 3 out of the 4 games of 9 or more targets. Those kind of levels of opportunities are just going to continue to build and give me confidence in going ahead and starting Christian Kirk every single week. Now, they take on the Houston Texans, which is an extremely easy run script matchup. They're going to run the ball heavily and find a lot of success with James Robinson. But if they get down to the red zone, if they want to uncork a ball and send it in the direction of Christian Kirk, they're going to find success. This is not a strong enough defense to be able to bottle him up. I'm expecting him to step up and ball out once again this week as our number 16 wide receiver in an advantageous in-division matchup. Moving on to Courtland Sutton, taking on the Indianapolis Colts on Thursday Night Football. Now, a couple of the stats that I wanted to mention in regards to Courtland Sutton. Of course, in the last 3 weeks consecutively, he's put up 13 or more fantasy points, which is incredible. Just this last week scored his first touchdown of the year. Shouldn't have been his first. He honestly should have 3 touchdowns by now, but that's a different conversation in itself. Already, thus far this season, he has commanded 40.25% of the receiving air yards within this offense. As long as we're in that conversation and it continues to go in his direction in terms of deep passing threats, of course, Courtland Sutton is going to find a lot of success. My only concern this week is the matchup. He takes on Stefon Gilmore in terms of coverage. And Stefon Gilmore has looked pretty good this season. Now, if he has a couple matchups against Kenny Moore, beautiful. Kenny Moore is the cornerback as of this team that's been getting cooked, which should maybe help Jeudy. But my main thoughts around this offense is with Javonte Williams going down and, of course, Melvin Gordon being the next man up at the running back position, maybe they don't run the ball as much. Maybe they continue to have to throw the ball. And if they're doing so, Courtland Sutton is certainly going to benefit from that. Moving on, we have Jaylen Waddle, who as of right now, we are not 100% certain that he is fully healthy. And that is definitely something that we're trying to kind of weave through and try to balance and try to see if he can go ahead and get a full rep of practice by the time we get to Friday. Because if he doesn't, this may be one of those weeks where he's honestly just limited, just like last week. We saw him often against Cincinnati Bengals limping off to the sideline after a route. I know he likes to play it tough, and he wants to play injured if he can help his team, but he's got to be fully healthy for the rest of the season, especially with Teddy Bridgewater under center rather than Tua. That all being mentioned, I'm expecting this quarterback change to lead to him getting less targets, and if that's going to be the case, it could be pretty detrimental to his overall fantasy value. That all being mentioned, when he took on the New York Jets last year, he put up 16.6 fantasy points. Of course, he knows how to dominate against this defense. I'm expecting him to do so. He's just got to be fully healthy. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr., our number 19. This morning, Jonathan Taylor was deemed out, and he is not going to play in the Thursday night matchup on a short week. So is that going to potentially lead to Michael Pittman Jr. seeing more targets? Well, unfortunately, I don't know if that can guarantee us more targets. Coming off a week in which he only had 3 catches, 6 targets, and 31 receiving yards, that level of opportunity, especially against Tennessee defense, just doesn't look right. But I will go ahead and give you guys a little bit of insight. For those of you who are Michael Pittman Jr. managers, there were 2 touchdowns that he could have very easily scored. Unfortunately, stepped out of bounds both times. That in itself had led to his overall production not being great. Now, despite the fact that he has to take on Patrick Surtain Jr., I'm expecting him to go ahead, see a little bit more targets than he typically does, and with that, hopefully step up in the matchup and ball out this week because Jonathan Taylor's out and they need somebody else to step up besides Nyheim Hines within this offense. Moving on to DK Metcalf, our number 20. DK Metcalf has been pretty good in the last 2 weeks. The fact that he has already seen 22 targets in just the last 2 games already is incredible. That leads me to believe that Geno Smith feels far more comfortable within this offense and is going to continue to air it out. Of course, last week, 7 catches, 149. The week prior, had himself 5 catches, had himself a touchdown within those 5 receptions. Overall, we're trending in the right direction for DK Metcalf. The only question is Marshawn Lattimore going to be his kryptonite? Because we have seen some wide receivers find a lot of success against Marshawn Lattimore, cough, cough, specifically Justin Jefferson last week. And of course, we've seen other wide receivers like Mike Evans not do so well. I'm expecting DK Metcalf to find himself a successful game, even though last year he took on the New Orleans Saints and put up 15.6 fantasy points. He had 2 catches. One of those catches, 84 yards and a touchdown because Marshawn Lattimore fell down and the safety that came over the top to try to make the tackle missed. With all that context out there, he is still one of these wide receivers that with 1 reception can go to the house and make his entire fantasy week. And that's why we're continuing to start him against the Saints. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. In the 2 matchups he played against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense last year, incredible fantasy production, 15.7, 25.7. Now, luckily for many of us, Brandin Cooks finally showed up this last week, but it was purely a matter of him just getting unlucky throughout the first 3 weeks of the season. We had talked about it in weeks past in the idea that Brandin Cooks should have had 2 touchdowns already by the end of week 3. But wasn't the circumstance, and it wasn't going to potentially kind of fear us away from not starting him. By the time I got to Sunday morning, I had Brandin Cooks as my number 23 wide receiver on the stream. Hopefully you guys started him as such. He obviously had himself a great performance at 15 fantasy points, finally got his first touchdown and got many of us off his back in terms of pressuring him. Like, come on, you got to show up already, man. You got to be that consistent wide receiver we were hoping you were going to be. And luckily, he's getting back on track, has another matchup here to solidify that going up against the Jacksonville defense. Moving on to Amari Cooper, another one of these wide receiver twos at the back end of this conversation, who has already commanded 43.75% of his team's air yards. When they are throwing the ball in his direction, of course, he's going to find success. But unfortunately, this last week, he pretty much disappeared. 4 targets, 1 catch, 9 receiving yards. Those look very eerily similar to his overall production in week 1. So if we're going to see a couple weeks in which he completely disappears, and then on the other end of the spectrum, a couple weeks where he's having 100 plus receiving yards and a touchdown, of course, it's a coin flip. And with those kind of scenarios, I'm willing to go ahead, start him once again this week against the Los Angeles Chargers, a relatively favorable matchup for him. Despite the fact that the Chargers have made improvements defensively, they really haven't been able to stop anybody, especially wide receiver ones. Just like I mentioned moments ago, Brandin Cooks, 7 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown. Of course, the Jaguars wide receivers a couple weeks back, 20 receptions between the 3 primary, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, and Marvin Jones. 20 catches, 190 and 3 touchdowns. And Davante Adams in week 1, 10 catches, 141 and a touchdown. I'm expecting Amari Cooper to follow in their footsteps. Moving on to Chris Olave, taking on the Seattle Seahawks defense. Chris Olave is one of my favorite wide receivers this year. He's continuing the ball out. He's continuing to be the primary receiving threat of this offense, and obviously had himself a great performance against the Minnesota Vikings defense because of the absence of Michael Thomas and Jameis Winston. And even though many of you were doubtful of the idea that Andy Dalton could come in and help him out, I told y'all, listen, Andy Dalton can help elevate Darnell Mooney to another level. Why not Chris Olave, another young wide receiver that is continuing to make strides towards greatness? Now, already this season, Chris Olave is the number 1 receiving threat in terms of targets, 20 or more yards down the field. He has 14 targets that have led to 6 receptions of that variety. As long as he is in this conversation, they're going to continue to feature him as a number 1 receiving threat. With Alvin Kamara coming back and defenses having to stack the box at times, Chris Olave continues to get more and more opportunity. The final wide receiver in our wide receiver 2 conversation is Drake London. Even though he did not have a great week this last week, mainly because Marcus Mariota put together a Justin Fields-esque kind of performance of only 7 passing completions, Drake London will eventually get back on track. Had 7 targets, 2 catches, 2 of the 7 overall completed passes made within that game for Marcus Mariota. But thus far this season has gotten himself 32.65% of the target share. Going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they have a pretty good run-stopping defense, and this is a run-first team. Maybe they'll be able to take advantage and blow through that defense, but I doubt that being the case. I'm expecting to see Drake London in garbage time catching a bunch of passes. All right, so as you can see on screen, we have our number 13 to 24 wide receiver rankings for Week 5 of the 2022 season. Again, rankings are subject to change. As the week progresses, we're going to hear of injuries. We're going to hear of players on the defensive side of the ball potentially missing, which could end up impacting an overall player's ranked. Be sure to join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kick off with Kirk. We'll have free rankings on screen for those of you who want to go ahead and check that out. Outside of that, let's go ahead and move on. All right, beginning the wide receiver 3 conversation, we have Tyler Lockett as our number 25. Tyler Lockett in the last 3 weeks has totaled 30 targets and 24 receptions. He has been far better than I ever anticipated him to be this season, especially with Geno Smith. I mean, that transition alone from Russell Wilson to Geno Smith looked like a huge down tilt. But as of the last 3 weeks, it is apparent that it's not that big of a difference. If the quarterback is capable of throwing the ball and has an arm, he's going to get it to these talented wide receivers, and that's exactly what has happened. This upcoming week, they take on the New Orleans Saints, which isn't a completely negative matchup. I think it's relatively neutral. It's going to be purely based on the talent of Tyler Lockett and whether or not he can go ahead and expand upon this offense. A guy that currently has 40% of his team's air yards going in his direction. Whew, Tyler Lockett, the sky's the limit. I'm just waiting for him to make one of these catches 20 yards down the field and go to the house and make himself a top 12 wide receiver at the end of a given week. Moving on to Keenan Allen. I'm not 100% certain as to whether or not he's going to play, but we have to always mention him because, again, he is one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. When he is healthy, he's averaging over 14 fantasy points per game with Justin Herbert, and he takes on the Cleveland Browns this week, who he himself found a lot of success against last season. 9 targets, 6 catches, 75 yards, 10.5 fantasy points, and a half PPR scoring format in said matchup. Based on the fact that we saw Josh Palmer and DeAndre Carter be absolutely irrelevant in the offensive scheme last week, I'm expecting to see Keenan Allen step in, take a lot of the targets that Austin Eckler has recently seen, a lot of the targets that are going in the direction of Gerald Everett, consolidate it in his direction, and get him back to being that 10 target per week monster. He's just got to be healthy. The advantageous matchup is available. He's just got to be ready to go by Sunday. Moving on, we have Allen Lazard as our number 27. Allen Lazard very easily may be the number 1 wide receiver of this offense, and there may be some contesting arguments in regards to maybe Romeo Doubs being that, but like we predicted earlier this offseason, of course, Allen Lazard is going to step up and just immediately be Aaron Rodgers' number 1 in this offense. And when you're associated as being the number one of an Aaron Rodgers-led offense, we know statistically over the past decade plus how much success can be had. I mean, already in the 3 games that he has played, 2 of those games in which he scored a touchdown, and just this last week, over 100 receiving yards. When we're on that pace of where we're playing 96% of the offensive snaps, have an advantageous matchup in London against the New York Giants this upcoming week, I'm expecting Allen Lazard, because of the association with the quarterback play, to be an incredible fantasy play this week once again. Moving on to another Green Bay Packers wide receivers. Now, like I mentioned, Romeo Doubs could be considered the number one of this team, but either way, both these wide receivers have immense value because they're pretty much splitting what Davante Adams was earning last year in terms of targets, in terms of receptions, all of that. But over the last 2 weeks, Romeo Doubs has proven, in my opinion, that he's a guy that is going to be on the field for majority of the time and could very easily be this next breakout wide receiver for this offense. The fact that he has seen 8 targets in each of the last 2 weeks and has scored at least 1 touchdown in each of the last 2 weeks gives me a lot of confidence. In fact, just this last weekend, could have had himself a second receiving touchdown. Unfortunately, that ball popped out when he hit the ground, and it pretty much was one of those, yes, I made 2 steps, but because the ground forced the fumble, it's an incomplete pass. Nonetheless, a lot of value when you're in association with Aaron Rodgers, and that is why we have back-to-back Green Bay Packers wide receivers in the wide receiver 3 conversation. Moving on to Jerry Jeudy. Like I mentioned earlier, when Stefon Gilmore is going to be covering, of course, Courtland Sutton on one side of the field, Jerry Jeudy may have an opportunity of going up against Kenny Moore. And if that's going to be the case, Jerry Jeudy will be able to take advantage of it. Though he hasn't seen many targets this season and really hasn't found much overall success, he's already had 2 games in which he scored a touchdown, week 1 and week 4. Week 4's contest, of course, was able to go ahead, run down the seam, wide open. When you have 4 wide receiver options running down the field, it's going to spread that defense thin. You're going to find pockets within the zone, and that's exactly what they did. Jerry Jeudy could very easily step up, and if this running game with Melvin Gordon leading the way is inefficient, we may be seeing a lot more passing coming out of Russ. Let Russ cook. Let's ride. Moving on to Curtis Samuel, our number 30. They take on the Tennessee Titans defense. It is a 5-star matchup because wide receivers have found a lot of success against this defense. But purely, it's going to be a matter of whether or not Carson Wentz can elevate his game based on what we've seen in the last 2 weeks and once again be a great quarterback. Of course, even though Jahan Dotson has been the touchdown monster of this team, I do want to mention that the Tennessee Titans defensive backs have given up 9 receiving touchdowns already this season to wide receivers and tight ends. If there is going to be a conversation of Curtis Samuel continuing to get his 10 targets per week, of course, I expect him to be the number 1 receiving potential option in terms of fantasy points from the Washington Commanders offense. Now, the other option within this offense is Terry McLaurin. And in the same vein, he needs to be addressed and potentially started because of how advantageous this potential matchup is. Let's not get fooled by the fact that, of course, we saw Michael Pittman Jr. have 2 opportunities of scoring a touchdown. And in both those circumstances, he had 1 foot out of bounds. There's a very good chance that Terry McLaurin, of course, in this offense is going to have himself great opportunities. And if, in fact, Carson Wentz steps up, we could end up seeing ourselves a great week here as a wide receiver 3 option with even more upside than usual. Moving on, let's talk about Robert Woods. Speaking of this matchup against the Washington Commanders, Robert Woods is going to be the number 1 wide receiver for this team henceforth. Because of Treylon Burks' injury, there really isn't any other wide receivers that Ryan Tannehill even trusts within this offense. Again, in the last 3 weeks, he has had 4 receptions minimum in each of those contests. This last week, had himself a receiving touchdown. The week prior, had himself a boatload of yardage. As long as Robert Woods continues to maintain as the number 1 receiving option of this offense, going up against an incredibly advantageous matchup, this defense giving up 38.35 fantasy points per week to opposing wide receivers thus far this season, I'm expecting Robert Woods to have himself another one of these big games and seeing a lot more targets go in his direction. Moving on to number 33, DJ Moore. Who would have thought that more targets lead to more fantasy points, huh? Opportunity leads to success, and that's what I continue to preach in regards to fantasy football every single year because it's a fact. And luckily, the fantasy gods and Baker Mayfield heard our prayers. He not only targeted Christian McCaffrey 9 times, he targeted DJ Moore 11 times. And that is super promising because DJ Moore was at least able to get himself 9.1 fantasy points, even though he only caught 6 of the 11 eligible targets. Yes, a lot of incomplete passes are going to be in the fault of Baker Mayfield because they're just inaccurate or overthrown passes. But overall, as long as those targets are going in his direction, we have seen DJ Moore with terrible quarterbacks over the last couple years maintain a pretty good fantasy standing. So I'm hoping once again for him to do the same. Moving on, we have Gabriel Davis taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't know if Gabriel Davis is at a full capacity, but let's say, for example, he is. He would be far higher ranked than 34. and especially if, in fact, Isaiah McKenzie misses this upcoming week due to a concussion. We know Jamison Crowder broke his ankle. There is a lot of turnover in this offense and potentially a lot of pieces missing. But where majority of the targets have gone in the last 2 weeks that have pretty much been void of going in the direction of Gabriel Davis, who many of us were hoping was going to get a lot more targets in the last 2 contests, they've been going in the direction of Bills running backs. The combination of Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, and James Cook, along with even the fullback of this team, have combined for 26 targets and 20 receptions in just the last 2 weeks alone. Again, if we're going to start transitioning back to throwing the ball towards the wide receiver position, Gabriel Davis has high upside. We know that. We know his potential, and we know that this offense is going to have a pretty advantageous week in the matchup alone, and the fact that Kenny Pickett may be going ahead and throwing a lot of picks, which will hopefully lead to more fantasy points for these Bills wide receivers. Moving on, we have Michael Thomas as our number 35. He's still dealing with that foot injury. I don't know what his current status is. And of course, we saw him miss that London game, even though he flew out there. There's a chance that he could play. And if he does, of course, he's Michael Thomas. He's a very talented wide receiver. And even though Chris Olave is getting a lot of targets, there's enough room for 2 of these guys to command this offense. So if Michael Thomas is available, we'll go ahead and play him as such. But there may be some other options there, like an Adam Thielen, that could be available, that you could slip into this wide receiver 3 conversation. The final player that I wanted to mention, though, on today's episode is Diontae Johnson. Mainly, I wanted to encompass the entire receiving core for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't know what's going to happen. Kenny Pickett has a very tough strength of schedule going forward. And mainly because of the switch at the quarterback position, we saw Diontae Johnson for the first time in like 6 games have less than 10 overall opportunities in terms of targets. That in itself is concerning, considering he had a game of 4 targets, 2 catches, 11 receiving yards. If we're going to go ahead and break the streak of 10 targets, and now we're going to transition to Kenny Pickett, who may be just looking for Pickens, Claypool, and maybe just, running the ball when he doesn't see anything open down the field instead of throwing it to tight pockets, we may be in a little bit of a tough situation where Diontae Johnson may have to sit for the next month of our fantasy leagues. We'll just have to wait and see. That's going to cover it for today's episode. We're going to go ahead and throw up our top 36 wide receiver rankings, finishing off with 25 through 36, giving you guys a little bit of a representation visually in terms of what we can anticipate to see and what I'm anticipating this upcoming weekend. Now that we've gone ahead and showed this off, be sure to go ahead, click the like button down below, subscribe to the channel if you have not yet already. Of course, we have a Patreon down below for those of you who are trying to get our rankings, and of course, your questions answered by me personally. Thank you everybody for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.